The report talks about the complicated history behind hormone replacement therapy. Can you talk a bit about why there's a complicated history?
So it's, well, how much time do you have? But it's recently there's been a lot of attention to the findings from this one study called the Women's Health Initiative, or the WHI. This was a study, it was announced in the early 90s, and I believe to date is still the largest women's health clinical trial ever conducted, at least in this country for sure. But I guess let's talk about why it was conducted in the first place, which was truly remarkable. It was backed by over $600 million in NIH funding, and it was meant to sort of make up for all the lost time in which women were excluded from research. So they ended up enrolling over 160,000 women in the US, all postmenopausal, and they wanted to study areas where they had significant gaps in women's health research, which was primarily chronic conditions like heart disease, cancer, osteoporosis, dementia, but also things like blood clots. And this was all how it related to receipt of HRT. Now, prior to the WHI, there were already a number of observational studies in the late 80s, early 90s that showed that compared to women who were not treated with hormone therapy, those that were treated tended to have lower rates of heart disease, lower all-cause mortality, less cognitive decline, so like all great things. So HRT prescribing was not a new thing. Providers were already widely using it, aside from just the typical menopausal symptoms that we think about. But they were using it to prevent heart disease and these other kind of long-term chronic conditions. So they needed a clinical trial to confirm these findings. So what they did was, they randomized these women to either receive a combination of conjugated equine estrogens and MPA, it's medroxyprogesterone acetate, which is essentially just an estrogen-progestin combo. This is for the group that had a uterus. If they didn't have a uterus, they just received the estrogen or a placebo. And the reason I was like focusing on those names so much is because that's not what's used anymore. This was a birth control style pill of synthetic estrogen and progestin, not the FDA approved HRT products we use today. So, they just examined one dose of one medication, and that's really important to note because that's a huge limitation of the study. And so I'm kind of skipping a lot here, but they eventually had to stop the study early because they said that HRT, that group, they had an increased risk of breast cancer, risk of blood clots, and cardiovascular disease. Now, this was 2002, and they did something very bizarre, I thought. They held a press conference to announce that they were stopping the study. And the press conference actually preceded the publication from the study, which is also really wild to think about, and it's like not common practice. And it seemed like almost overnight, prescribing for HRT just plummeted. So there's some estimates that say, at that time, around 40% of eligible women were on HRT. And after that press conference, it was reduced to like 5%. So this amount of attention may have been warranted if the data were interpreted correctly. And that's how we get to where we are today, where we have an entire generation of physicians who were never taught how to prescribe HRT, generations of women who were taught to be afraid of it. And I mean, like, let's just call it what it is. It's fear-based medicine. But I want to go back and just focus on the actual findings and how they were interpreted versus what the data showed. So the main finding that got all of the attention was the women that were in the synthetic progestin estrogen group. This is the group that had a uterus. They had an increase in the incidence of breast cancer, but there was no effect on mortality. Now, they reported the relative risk for this group, which was a 24% increase in incidence of breast cancer. So that 24%, that's a number that sounds really scary when you say it out loud. What was completely ignored was the absolute risk. Now, if you're not a researcher or, if you don't read these types of studies, that probably doesn't mean much to you. But you see the NIH getting up there and doing a press conference to announce that they're ending this massive trial that everyone was so excited about because of breast cancer risk. And that's that's probably enough to scare away the average person from ever looking at HRT again, which that's exactly what happened. And the absolute risk increase was 0.1%. To me, that is such an egregious misinterpretation of the data. So why is there a complicated history to HRT? Well, I just listened to a really great talk between two leading physicians in this field, Dr. Rachel Rubin and Dr. Kelly Casperson. And they said that, the real danger to women isn't HRT, it's bad science.